So parents who are cooperative rather than assertive, I think this is a big deal. Lots of times parents tend to uh, read books, look on the internet, listen to people like me, whatever, and find and to kind of design a plan for what should happen to their children. Now, of course, that's not totally bad, but sometimes we should be a little bit more responsive rather than assertive. So what that means is we don't, for example, don't ever wake up a kid to feed them unless you absolutely have to. That's an example of being cooperative rather than assertive. If you think, well, he has to eat at 3 o'clock, but he's sound asleep. To wake him up at 3 o'clock to feed him when he's sound asleep, that's too assertive. If a baby is sound asleep, the baby needs to sleep. And when they wake up, they may want to eat. Now, again, there's some balance there that's healthy, of course, but parents who say, I'm going to pay attention to the kid, I'm going to listen to the kid, I'm going to look for their signals, I'm going to kind of watch them, I'm going to take some of my cues from the child, as opposed to just imposing a schedule or structure or a thing on the child all the time, sometimes develop more secure and healthy attachment in the child. Uh, I think that there are, you can of course be way too responsive to the child and too indulgent with the child. I think, for example, this new parenting wave that is so indulgent of the child, and I don't remember what you call it, the attachment parenting, I think they call it. That I just think there are just parts of that are just ludicrous. Nursing a kid for years, until they're 3 and 4 or 5 and 6 years old, it's just stupid. Letting your kids sleep in your bed. Here's a rule from a therapist and a parenting person: never, never, never start letting your child sleep in your bed. There's no reason for it. If they're scared, help them learn that they can sleep in their bed and they don't need to be scared. Go sit on the edge of the bed with them. Take them back to the room. Spend some time with them. Calm them down. Do not invite them into your bed. If you've ever done that and you've ever had a kid get used to sleeping in your bed, you know that it becomes really hard to get them to quit. I think that you should show them from the time they're very, very small that we don't have other people sleep in our bed. This is a place where the parents sleep and you don't belong in here. I think it's indulgent and it's ridiculous to have your kids sleep in your bed. So I'm sorry, that's a little bit of I'm getting on a soapbox a bit, but that overindulgence is not right. At the same time, being cooperative with the kid, kind of finding that middle road where you respond to them and they respond to you, is a healthy thing. Fourth thing, parents who promote secure and good attachment are accessible to the child. They're there for the kid. Now, they can live their own life, they can have their own world, and not the child not be the center of everything that happens, but they need to be accessible. Parents who tend to have good self-esteem, good sense of identity, know who they are and feel good about it, tend to develop more securely attached kids. A sense of competence, knowing what we're doing, not feeling like we're completely stumbling around. Being affectionate, being flexible. Flexibility, I've said this before, flexibility is always a sign of health. Rigidity is almost always a sign of dysfunction. Parents need to be flexible. If you're rigid and you're a parent, you will fail miserably because children are not rigid. They are flexible. Remember, we're talking about going where the wild things are. If you're not flexible, you will fail. And lastly, Ainsworth said, caregivers and children seem to have an interactive kind of synchrony. Synchrony, of course, means things happening at the same time. She said she seemed to see that within caregivers and children that there was this kind of sense that that about the time that the mother wanted to pick up the child wanted to be picked up. Kind of this sense that about the time it was time for the kid to go to bed, the mom was ready to put them to bed. Just this, they began to have this timing thing that seemed to work well. That was where they almost kind of knew what the other one was doing, and they developed a kind of a structure on their own that wasn't kind of artificial and imposed on them, but just began to happen between the mother and the child, or the caregiver and the child. And that's kind of a big deal, I think, and an important thing, that notion of interactive synchrony. Positive results of secure attachment. There's a decent amount of research that says people who have secure attachment as small children or infants tend to have good results later in life. You can look at that. At 24 months, they're compliant, they have positive affect and play. 3 years, they had more leadership, more sympathy for others, better socially. At 5 years, seem to be more resilient, more flexible, more resourceful. Erickson there in '85 had a study that looked at kids with poor attachment and found that they were more dependent, less compliant, more hostile, more impulsive. You can look at those and see that it's clear that people who have less secure attachment tend to not do as well as they go through life. At the bottom there, you see that mothers who have good attachment to their children seem to have good attachment to their own mothers. So it may be that attachment is even something that becomes kind of intergenerational, that we can perpetuate with our children and their children by figuring out how to have good attachment between caregiver and a child. So when we think about the thing that's kind of received the most attention the last 50 years in parenting, the thing that everybody thinks that kids need more than anything else, the thing that we blame for everything and give credit for, it's always this. It's self-esteem. Now, I want us to think in terms, and I think I've mentioned this to you before, way back at the beginning, that it may be that we focus way too much on self-esteem, that we need to think about identity instead of self-esteem. Parenting is one of those places where I think that's a big, big deal. So I would challenge you to think a little bit about how you think about self-esteem. What is it? Where does it come from? What does it mean? What are the problems with it? What are the good things about it? Evaluate it a little bit for yourself. This is one of the ways that I kind of tend to evaluate it. I think we need to replace our emphasis on self-esteem with an emphasis on identity. And I think that's particularly true with our kids. I think we need to teach our kids to have a solid, healthy identity, to know who they are, not to think that they're great. I think self-esteem as a real basic idea is antithetical to Christianity. I don't think that we ought to go around beating ourselves up, because I think that the price has already been paid for our pitifulness. So I'm not a proponent that we need to walk around and say, oh, I'm horrible, I'm horrible, I'm horrible, and I should be punished all the time, because the price has been paid. We live in a state of grace. But I'm also not a proponent of the idea that I should be walking around thinking, I'm pretty good, I'm pretty cool, I'm a good person, I'm good at what I do. I don't think that's particularly healthy for us. I think it's much more healthy for me to think, I know who I am. I know what I can do, I know what I can't do, I know what I'm good at doing, I know what I'm not so good at doing. I have a good sense of who I am. I think that's much more healthy than just this kind of overall global sense of I'm good, which is what self-esteem means. I esteem myself. I like myself. I think that I'm good. I don't know why we need that. I think what we need is to know who we are. I don't think, sometimes people who promote self-esteem use the scripture, love your neighbor as yourself, and then they say, if you don't love yourself, you can't love your neighbor. That's a ridiculous interpretation of scripture. Of course, we're supposed to love our neighbor. My proposal is that scripture assumes that we love ourselves, and that the idea there is not, you need to love yourself a lot, because that's how much you can love your neighbor. So if you love yourself a ton, then you're able to love your neighbor a ton. I don't think that's even close to being true or real. I really think that what the admonition there is that you ought to try to love your neighbor at least as much as you love yourself. You all love yourselves. You all pay more attention to yourself than anybody else. You're all focused on yourself. You ought to love your neighbor that much. That would be a revolution. Even people who feel bad about themselves, who we say have bad self-esteem, are selfish and egocentric. If you just think about it, it's easy to see with somebody like me that I'm egocentric because I grew up in a family that taught me that I was wonderful, way more wonderful than I really am. And so I grew up with this real healthy, maybe, concept of how good I am. I'm pretty confident. I feel competent most of the time. I tend to think that I'm right. I tend to think that I'm as smart as you, or sometimes smarter. I have all of those things going on in me. To a point, that's okay, but to another point, it's really pathological. But it's easy if you're hanging around with me to see that I have some egocentricity and some selfishness. But then there are those people who just act like, oh, I'm so pitiful, I'm so stupid, or I'm so ugly, or I'm so unsuccessful, or nobody likes me. Well, the truth is those people are just as egocentric as the rest of us. They're thinking about themselves all the time. They may put themselves down, but their focus is consistently on them. How does this make me feel? How bad am I? How many people like me or don't like me? We're all self-consumed. We're all selfish. We're all egocentric. We just do it in some different ways.